Everyone remembers the night when fear quietly entered the city. It didn't come with screams or sirens. It came silently, hiding behind normal faces, normal streets, and normal lives. This story is about a man who looked like everyone else. He had a job. He had neighbors. He had a routine. But inside him lived something dark, something empty, something evil. For years, no one noticed him. He lived alone in a small rented apartment, always polite, always calm. The kind of man people describe as quiet or harmless. He paid his bills on time, greeted neighbors with a soft smile, and never caused trouble. But when the sun went down, his real world began. From a very young age, something was wrong. As a child, he showed no emotion, no fear, no guilt. While other kids cried, he stared. While others laughed, he watched. Teachers thought he was shy. His parents thought he was introverted. They never thought he was dangerous. But inside his mind, violent thoughts were growing. Thoughts he never spoke about. Thoughts he carefully hid. By his teenage years, he discovered something terrifying about himself. He enjoyed control. Not power in a normal sense, but control over fear, over pain, over life. He started small, breaking things, hurting animals, watching people from a distance, memorizing routines, learning patterns. To him, humans were not people. They were experiments. Years later, when he moved to the city, he blended in perfectly. He learned how to smile when required, how to speak just enough, how to appear normal. But every night, alone in his apartment, he wrote things down. Dates, times, locations. Not plans, but fantasies. The city was growing fast. New faces every day, crowded streets, busy lives. And that made it perfect, because no one notices when one person disappears. His first victim wasn't planned. It was spontaneous. A late night, an empty street, a moment of opportunity. Someone trusted him, and that was their final mistake.
Days turned into weeks as they traveled deeper into the desert. The familiar landmarks disappeared. The air grew heavier, the nights colder, and the silence more unsettling. Then, one evening, something unexpected appeared on the horizon. Not dunes. Not rock formations. But shapes. Straight lines. Angles. Structures. The impossible city. As they approached, Carter felt something he had never experienced before, not excitement, but unease. Half buried beneath centuries of sand stood the ruins of a massive city. Columns. Walls. Pathways. All carved with the same unknown symbols from the map. "This is impossible," Carter whispered. There was no record of any civilization existing here. No history. No mention. Nothing. And yet, the city stood, silent and abandoned, as if time itself had forgotten it. The first sign of mystery. As the team entered the ruins, they noticed something disturbing. There were no signs of destruction. No evidence of war. No natural disaster. It was as if the entire population had simply vanished. In the center of the city, they found a large stone structure, almost like a temple. On its entrance was a symbol unlike the others. A circle, with lines crossing through it in perfect symmetry. Hassan stopped immediately. His face turned pale. "We should not go inside," he said firmly. But Carter, driven by curiosity, stepped forward. Because deep down, he knew one thing. This was no ordinary discovery. This was something the world had never seen before. And perhaps something the world was never supposed to find. The door that opened itself. As Carter approached the temple entrance, something strange happened. The ground beneath them trembled slightly. Then, a deep, echoing sound filled the air. The massive stone doors began to open on their own. No one touched them. No mechanism was visible. Just a slow, heavy movement, as if something inside had been waiting. Waiting for them. Carter stood frozen. Behind him, his team hesitated. And in front of him, darkness. A darkness that felt alive. He took one step inside. And in that moment, The mystery truly began. The moment Dr. Elias Carter stepped inside the temple, the air changed. It wasn't just darker. It felt heavier. Like the walls themselves were watching. Behind him, the rest of the team hesitated at the entrance. Only Hassan al-Rafiq remained still, refusing to cross the threshold. "You go in," Hassan said quietly, "but remember, some places are not empty. They are waiting." Carter ignored the warning. He lifted his lantern and moved forward. The Hall of Symbols. Inside, the temple opened into a vast chamber. The ceiling stretched high above, supported by enormous stone pillars covered in the same strange symbols they had seen outside. But here, they were more detailed. More complex. Almost like a language. Carter stepped closer to one of the pillars, running his fingers gently across the carvings. "These aren't decorations," he whispered. "They're records, or messages." His assistant quickly began sketching them, while another set up equipment to document everything. But something felt wrong. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. Not normal silence. A silence so complete, it felt unnatural. No wind. No echo. No sound of their own footsteps. It was as if the temple was absorbing everything. The moving shadows. As they reached the center of the hall, one of the assistants suddenly stopped. "Did you see that?" Everyone turned. "See what?" Carter asked. "There, on the wall," the assistant said, pointing. Something moved. Carter raised the lantern higher. The walls were still. The symbols unchanged. But for a brief second, he thought he saw it too. A shadow. Not cast by the lantern. But moving on its own. He shook his head. "Just your imagination," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. The chamber below. At the far end of the hall, they discovered a staircase, leading down. The steps were narrow, worn by time, and disappeared into complete darkness. Hassan's voice echoed faintly from the entrance behind them. "Do not go down." Carter paused. Then said, "This is exactly why we're here." And he began descending. One by one, the others followed. The heart of the temple. The staircase led to a circular underground chamber. In the center stood a massive stone object. Not a statue. Not an altar. Something different. It was perfectly smooth, unlike the rest of the temple. A large black structure, shaped like a vertical slab, covered with faint glowing lines. The symbols here were not carved. They were illuminated. Softly. As if alive. Carter stepped closer, his breath slowing. "This doesn't belong here," he whispered. "This doesn't belong to any known civilization." One of the assistants reached out. "Wait," Carter began. But it was too late. The moment the assistant's hand touched the surface, the chamber exploded with light. The sound without source. A deep vibration filled the air. Not a sound exactly. More like something felt inside the body. The glowing lines on the structure began to move, shifting like flowing energy. Then. A voice. Not spoken. Not heard. But understood. Inside their minds. "You have returned." Everyone froze. No one spoke. No one moved. The voice came again. The cycle begins again. Carter's heart raced. This isn't possible. Hassan's warning becomes real. Above them, at the temple entrance, Hassan al-Rafiq dropped to his knees. He could feel it. The ground trembling. The air shifting. "They opened it," he whispered in fear. They should not have opened it. The first sign of danger. Back in the chamber, the light suddenly stopped. Silence returned. But it was different now. Heavier. Watching. Then Carter noticed something that made his blood run cold. The symbols on the walls had changed. They were no longer random. They formed patterns. Repeating patterns. Like a message. Or a warning. And slowly, very slowly, those glowing lines began to spread. Not just on the structure, but across the floor. Creeping toward them. Carter stepped back. Everyone, move away. Now. But the lines were faster than they looked. Reaching. Growing. Alive. And in that moment, Carter realized something terrifying. They hadn't discovered the temple. The temple had awakened because of them. The glowing lines on the floor were no longer slow. They were moving. Fast. Like veins of light spreading across the stone, forming patterns that none of them could understand, but all of them could feel. Back. Everyone back, shouted Dr. Elias Carter. The team stumbled away from the center, but the chamber itself seemed to respond, as if their fear was feeding it. The black structure in the middle pulsed once. Then again. Like a heartbeat. The first contact. One of the assistants, trembling, whispered, "What is this place?" Before anyone could answer. The voice returned. Not from the air. Not from the structure. From inside their minds. You were not meant to arrive early. Carter pressed his hands against his head. "Who are you?" he said aloud, though he wasn't sure if speaking even mattered. A pause. Then. "We are what remains." Visions of the past. Suddenly, the chamber disappeared. Not physically, but in their perception. The team was no longer standing underground. They were seeing something else. A vision. The same city, but alive. Massive structures glowing under a dark sky. People, tall, silent figures, moving through the streets with purpose. The same symbols floating faintly in the air around them. This was not ancient Egypt. Not Rome. Not anything recorded in human history. It was something far older. Far more advanced. And completely erased from time. Carter's voice shook. This is impossible." The vision changed. Darkness spread across the sky. The glowing symbols began to flicker. The people in the city stopped. Frozen. As if they sensed something coming. Then. The same black structures, like the one in the chamber, began to rise from the ground all across the city. And the voice echoed again. "We reached beyond our time." The figures in the vision started to disappear. Not die. Not fall. Just vanish. One by one. As if erased. And time erased us in return. Back to reality. The vision shattered. Carter and his team collapsed onto the cold stone floor of the chamber, gasping for breath. "No," one assistant whispered, "that wasn't real." But Carter knew. It was real. More real than anything they had seen before. The truth begins to unfold. The glowing structure dimmed slightly, as if calming. Carter slowly stood up, his mind racing. "You weren't destroyed," he said, thinking out loud. "You were removed." A pause. Then the voice answered. "Correct." Carter's eyes widened. By what? This time, the silence lasted longer. And when the answer came, it was colder. "By the law you do not yet understand." Hassan enters the temple. Above ground, Hassan al-Rafiq could no longer stay outside. The trembling had grown stronger. The air felt wrong. He took a deep breath, and stepped inside the temple. "For them," he whispered. And began walking down. The warning too late. Back in the chamber, the glowing lines suddenly stopped. Everything became still again. Too still. Carter looked around. Why has it stopped? No answer. Then. The structure in the center changed. The smooth surface cracked slightly, revealing something inside. Light. Brighter than before. And then the voice spoke one final time. Because now, it begins. Something comes through. The light burst outward. The chamber shook violently. The air twisted, like space itself was being pulled apart. And from within the structure, something moved. Not fully visible. Not fully formed. But something was coming through. At that exact moment, Hassan reached the chamber entrance. He saw the light. He saw the shape. And his face turned pale with terror. They didn't just open it, he whispered. They brought it back. Carter stood frozen. Watching. As the unknown presence slowly emerged. And deep inside, he realized something horrifying. This was never a ruin. This was never a lost city. This was a prison. And they had just opened the door. The chamber shook as if the earth itself was trying to reject what was happening below. Light poured out from the cracked structure, too bright to look at directly, yet impossible to ignore. Dr. Elias Carter raised his arm to shield his eyes, but it didn't help. The light wasn't just outside, it was inside his mind. Then. Silence. Complete. Absolute. And from the center of the chamber, something stepped forward. Not a creature. Not human. At first, it had no clear shape. Just a distortion in the air, like heat rising from the desert, but colder. Much colder. Then slowly, it began to take form. A tall figure. Humanoid, but not human. Its body seemed to be made of shifting darkness and faint light, like the same glowing symbols were moving beneath its surface. Its face, if it had one, was impossible to focus on. Every time Carter tried to look directly at it, his vision blurred. One of the assistants whispered in fear. What is that? No one answered. Because no one had words. The presence. The moment it fully emerged, everyone felt it. Not fear. Something deeper. Like standing in front of something that should not exist. Something that didn't belong in their world. The entity didn't move aggressively. It simply stood there. Observing. Then. It looked at Carter. Not with eyes. But with awareness. And the voice returned. You are not of this cycle. Carter's breath shook. What are you? He managed to say. A pause. Then the answer. We are what remains, when time forgets. The chamber shook as if the earth itself was trying to reject what was happening below. Light poured out from the cracked structure, too bright to look at directly, yet impossible to ignore. Dr. Elias Carter raised his arm to shield his eyes, but it didn't help. The light wasn't just outside, it was inside his mind. Then. Silence. Complete. Absolute. And from the center of the chamber, something stepped forward. Not a creature. Not human. At first, it had no clear shape. Just a distortion in the air, like heat rising from the desert, but colder. Much colder. Then slowly, it began to take form. A tall figure. Humanoid, but not human. Its body seemed to be made of shifting darkness and faint light, like the same glowing symbols were moving beneath its surface. Its face, if it had one, was impossible to focus on. Every time Carter tried to look directly at it, his vision blurred. One of the assistants whispered in fear. What is that? No one answered. Because no one had words. The presence. The moment it fully emerged, everyone felt it. Not fear. Something deeper. Like standing in front of something that should not exist. Something that didn't belong in their world. The entity didn't move aggressively. It simply stood there. observing. Then it looked at Carter. Not with eyes, but with awareness. And the voice returned. You are not of this cycle. Carter's breath shook. What are you? He managed to say. A pause. Then the answer. We are what remains, when time forgets. Hassan's fear. At the entrance, Hassan al-Rafiq fell to his knees. No, no, this is wrong, he whispered. He had heard stories as a child. Stories of something buried beneath the sands. Not a city. Not treasure. But a sealed memory. And now. It was awake. The first reaction. One of the assistants panicked. This isn't real, he shouted, grabbing his equipment. We need to leave, now. He turned and ran toward the staircase. The entity did not move. But the moment the assistant reached the steps, the glowing lines on the floor flashed. And in an instant, he was gone. No sound. No trace. Just, gone. The entire chamber froze. The rule is broken. Carter stared in horror. What did you do? He shouted. The entity answered calmly. He attempted to exit the field. What field? Containment. Carter's heart pounded. Containment. That word changed everything. You said this was a prison, Carter whispered, realizing the truth. And we just opened it. The entity slowly began to move. Each step made the air heavier. Unstable. Reality itself seemed to bend slightly around it. This world is not prepared. Carter stepped back. Prepared for what? A pause. Then the answer came, colder than anything before. For what returns? The hidden truth. The glowing symbols on the walls suddenly lit up again, faster, brighter, forming clear patterns now. Carter looked closely. His mind racing. They weren't decorations, he said slowly. They were warnings. The entity turned toward the walls. They were instructions. Hassan steps forward. Despite his fear, Hassan forced himself to stand. He walked slowly down into the chamber. Every step heavy. Every breath difficult. You must go back, Hassan said, his voice trembling but firm. This place is not yours anymore. The entity turned toward him. For a moment, everything stopped. Then. You remember. Hassan's eyes widened. Yes, he whispered. My people, we remember enough to fear you. Begins. Suddenly, the chamber shook harder than before. Cracks began forming in the walls. Sand started falling from above. The temple itself was becoming unstable. The entity looked upward. Then back at Carter. The seal is broken. Carter felt it too. Something bigger was happening. Not just here. Beyond this place. The final warning. The entity took one more step forward. Closer to them. Closer to freedom. You have accelerated the return. Carter's voice shook. Return of what? The entity paused. And for the first time. It sounded almost certain. Of everything that was erased. The chamber began to collapse. Hassan shouted, we must leave, now. But Carter didn't move. Because he understood something terrifying. Leaving the temple wouldn't end this. It had already begun. And deep beneath the sands of the Sahara Desert. Something ancient had taken its first step back into the world. The first crack sounded like thunder. Then another. Within seconds, the entire chamber began to break apart. Chunks of stone fell from the ceiling as the ancient temple, silent for thousands of years, finally started to give way. Move, shouted Dr. Elias Carter. Dust filled the air. Visibility dropped. Panic spread through the remaining team. But the entity. It did not move. It simply stood there, calm, untouched, as if the destruction around it meant nothing. The race to escape. Hassan al-Rafiq grabbed Carter's arm. We must go now. This place is ending. Carter hesitated, looking back at the glowing structure, now completely fractured. No, he said under his breath, this is just the beginning. Another violent shake threw them off balance. The staircase leading upward began to collapse piece by piece. They had seconds. Something follows. As they rushed toward the exit, Carter felt it. A presence behind them. Not chasing. Not attacking. Following. He turned for a brief second. Through the dust and falling debris, he saw the entity. Walking. Slowly. Effortlessly. Toward them. Not trapped anymore. Breaking the surface. With one final push, they reached the top of the staircase and burst out of the temple entrance. The desert sky above looked different. Darker. The wind had picked up, swirling violently across the ruins. The entire buried city was shifting, structures cracking, sand rising like waves around them. What is happening? One assistant shouted. Hassan looked toward the horizon. This is not just the temple, he said in fear. The whole place is waking up. The desert reacts. The ground beneath their feet trembled again. But this time, it wasn't coming from below. It was spreading outward. Across the desert. The sand itself began to move unnaturally, forming patterns, spirals, almost like the same glowing symbols they had seen underground. Carter stared in disbelief. It's connected, he whispered. The city, the temple, the entire desert. The truth revealed. Behind them, the temple entrance collapsed completely, sealing the chamber once again. But it was too late. The entity was no longer inside. Carter slowly turned. And there it was. Standing just outside the ruins. Fully present. Fully real. Not hidden anymore. The first step into the world. The entity looked around, as if observing the desert for the first time in thousands of years. Then it spoke again, directly into their minds. This world remains, unchanged. Carter clenched his fists. What do you want? He demanded. A pause. Then. Correction. Suddenly, more vibrations echoed across the desert. Far in the distance, something else began to rise from beneath the Sahara Desert. Not one. Multiple points. Like the temple they had just opened. Hassan's face turned pale. There were never just one, he whispered. The realization. Carter's mind raced as the pieces came together. This wasn't a single prison, he said slowly. It was a network. The entity turned toward the horizon. Yes. The beginning of a global event. A strong wave of energy spread outward from the ruins, passing through the team like a cold wind. For a moment, everything went silent. Then. Far away, beyond the desert. Something responded. The final moment. Carter looked at the entity one last time. You said we started something, he said. What happens now? The entity gave its final answer for this moment. Now, others will awaken. The wind roared louder. The desert shifted. And across the world, unseen and unknown, ancient things began to stir. Carter stood frozen. Because he finally understood the truth. They hadn't discovered history. They had triggered its return. The wind over the Sahara Desert did not stop. It intensified. What had begun as a localized tremor was now something far greater, something spreading beyond the ruins, beyond the desert, beyond anything Carter had imagined. Dr. Elias Carter stood frozen, staring at the horizon where distant sands were rising unnaturally. This can't be contained, he whispered. Beside him, Hassan al-Rafiq closed his eyes. It was never meant to be, he said quietly. The first signal. Without warning, Carter's equipment, devices meant for simple archaeological recording, began to malfunction. Radios crackled. Compasses spun wildly. One of the assistants shouted, "Sir! You need to see this." On a small portable screen, strange patterns appeared, waves of energy, pulsing outward from their location. But it didn't stop there. The signal was spreading. Fast. Across continents. A disturbance in the north. Thousands of miles away, in the frozen silence of Antarctica, a research station recorded something impossible. Deep beneath the ice, seismic sensors detected movement. Not natural. Not tectonic. A perfect geometric vibration. Something, responding. Echoes in the east. In a remote region near Tibet, monks gathered inside an ancient monastery felt the ground tremble beneath them. Candles flickered violently. One of the elders opened his eyes slowly. "It has begun again," he said. The younger monks looked confused. "Master, what has begun?" The old man did not answer. Because the truth was older than words. Far below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, deep-sea monitoring systems captured a sudden shift. Pressure waves. Unusual heat signatures. And then. A structure. Hidden for centuries beneath layers of ocean floor. Now glowing faintly. Back in the desert. Carter lowered the device, his hands shaking. "This is global," he said. Hassan nodded slowly. "Yes. Then how do we stop it?" Carter asked. Hassan looked at the entity standing before them. "You don't stop something like this," he said. "You survive it, if you can." The entity's purpose. The entity remained calm, observing the expanding chaos like a scientist watching an experiment. Carter turned to it. "You're connected to all of this, aren't you?" he demanded. A pause. Then the answer came. "We are one of many." Carter's heart sank. "How many?" The entity did not respond directly. Instead, it looked toward the horizon again, where more disturbances were becoming visible. Enough. The hidden pattern. As Carter studied the signals again, something terrifying became clear. "These locations," he said slowly. "They're not random." He marked points on the map. Sahara Desert. Antarctica. Tibet. Pacific Ocean. They formed a pattern. A perfect geometric alignment across the planet. Hassan stepped closer. "What does it mean?" Carter swallowed. "It's not just awakening. It's activation." Suddenly, the air around them vibrated again. Stronger this time. The entity raised its head slightly. And then. Every device Carter had, turned on at once. Screens flickered. Signals spiked. And a single message appeared. Not in one language. In all languages. The cycle has resumed. The fear becomes real. One of the assistants dropped to his knees. "This isn't history," he said in terror. "This is something else." Carter didn't respond. Because deep down. He already knew. The final realization. Carter looked at the entity one last time. "You said we weren't meant to arrive early," he said. "What happens when it's complete?" For the first time. The entity's answer felt absolute. "Your world will become as ours once was." Carter's voice dropped to a whisper. "And what happened to yours?" A long silence. Then. It was corrected. The wind roared again. The sky darkened slightly. And across the earth. The awakenings continued. Carter stood still. Because now he understood the full truth. This wasn't just a mystery. This was a countdown. The desert was no longer silent. What once felt like an isolated event in the Sahara Desert had now become something far greater, something global, unstoppable, and deeply connected. Dr. Elias Carter stood over his equipment, trying to make sense of the signals flashing across the screen. "They're synchronizing," he said, his voice tight with fear. Beside him, Hassan al-Rafiq watched the horizon. "Not synchronizing," Hassan corrected quietly. "They are aligning. The map of fear." Carter quickly marked every known activation point. Sahara Desert, Antarctica, Tibet, Pacific Ocean. But now, more points were appearing. New signals. New awakenings. Across remote forests, deep mountains, and unexplored regions. Each one forming part of a massive, perfect geometric pattern across the Earth. "This isn't random," Carter said. "It's a system. The ancient design." The entity turned slightly, as if acknowledging his realization. "Yes." Carter's mind raced. "You built this, didn't you?" A pause. Then. "We began it." Hassan looked at the entity sharply. "And who finished it?" he asked. For a moment, even the wind seemed to stop. Then the answer came. "The ones beyond your time. A civilization too advanced." Carter remembered the vision they had seen underground, the ancient city, the advanced structures, the glowing symbols. "You were more advanced than us," he said slowly. "Far more." The entity did not deny it. "We reached beyond limits." "And that's why you were erased?" Carter asked. "Yes. The law of existence." Carter's voice grew steadier, despite the fear. "You mentioned a law, what law?" The entity turned fully toward him now. The air grew heavier again. "No civilization may exceed its cycle." Carter frowned. "What does that even mean?" The answer came like a final truth. "When a world advances too far, it is reset." The horror of the truth. Hassan stepped back in shock. "No," he whispered. Carter's face went pale. "You're saying, this has happened before?" The entity's response was immediate. "Many times. Not the first civilization." Carter's hands trembled. "All of human history," he said slowly, "everything we know, is just one cycle." Hassan finished. The entity remained silent. But the silence itself was the answer. The activation phase. Suddenly, Carter's device emitted a loud, continuous signal. "Something's changing," he said urgently. The map lit up. All the activation points were now connected. Lines of energy forming between them. A global network. Complete. The entity looked upward. "Phase 1 is complete." Carter's heart dropped. "Phase 1, he repeated. "The beginning of the end." The ground shook again, stronger than before. Not just in the desert. Everywhere. Across the world. Carter stared at the screen as new data poured in. Earthquakes. Energy spikes. Unexplained phenomena. "It's happening now," he whispered. Hassan's final warning. Hassan grabbed Carter's arm. "You must listen to me," he said urgently. "This is not something you can fight." Carter looked at him. "Then what do we do?" Hassan hesitated. Then said something unexpected. "You find the ones who stopped it before. The impossible hope." Carter blinked. "Stopped it?" "You said civilizations were erased." Hassan nodded. "Yes, but not completely." Carter's eyes widened. "You're saying, someone survived?" Hassan looked back at the ruins. "At least long enough, to leave warnings." "The entity confirms it." Carter turned to the entity one last time. "Is that true?" A long pause. Then. Fragments remain. The mission changes. Carter straightened. For the first time since this began, there was something else besides fear. A possibility. If there are fragments, he said, then there's knowledge. And if there's knowledge, there might be a way to stop this. The entity did not respond. But it did not disagree either. The final line. The sky darkened further. The wind roared louder. And across the earth, the pattern was complete. Carter looked at Hassan. "We're not done," he said. Hassan nodded slowly. "No," he replied. "This is where the Real story begins. And somewhere, hidden across the world, the fragments of a forgotten truth waited to be found." Echoes of survivors. Carter remembered Hassan's earlier words. Fragments remain. "You said someone survived before," Carter said. Hassan replied quietly. "Not survived, resisted. A hidden order." As Carter analyzed the data further, new signals began appearing, not from the activated sites, but from somewhere else. A different frequency. Older. Weaker. But still active. "These aren't part of the system," Carter said. "They're separate." Hassan's eyes narrowed. "They are not part of it," he said. "They are against it. The ones who remember." Far away, deep within the Himalayan mountains, a hidden structure stood untouched by time. Inside, a group of individuals sat in complete silence. Their eyes closed. Their breathing slow. Then suddenly, one of them opened his eyes. "They have opened the gate," he said. Another responded. Then the cycle begins again. A third voice, older, calmer, spoke. "No, this time, we intervene." Back in the desert. Carter turned to the entity. "If there are others, if there are people who know about this, why didn't they stop it before?" The entity remained still. Then answered. "They delayed it." Carter clenched his fists. "Then we find them." The entity's warning. For the first time, the entity's tone shifted slightly. Interference alters outcomes, but not inevitability. Carter stepped forward. "Nothing is inevitable." The entity did not argue. But it didn't agree either. A race against time. The signals across the world were growing stronger. The activation points were no longer just glowing, they were stabilizing. Becoming permanent. "This is getting worse," Carter said. Hassan nodded. "Then we must move." "Where?" Hassan pointed again. "To the center." The decision. Carter looked at the map. Then at the entity. Then at the collapsing ruins behind him. Everything had changed. This was no longer an expedition. This was a mission. "We go to the Himalayan mountains," he said firmly. Hassan nodded. "Yes." The final message. As they prepared to leave, the entity spoke one more time. "You seek fragments, but fragments cannot stop what is whole." Carter turned back. "Maybe not," he said. "But they can tell us how to break it." The journey begins again. The storm howled louder. The desert trembled beneath their feet. And far away, hidden in the highest mountains on earth, answers waited. But so did something else. Something that had been watching. Long before they arrived. Carter took one last look at the ruins. Then turned away. Because now he understood. The mystery was no longer buried. It was rising. The journey from the Sahara Desert to the Himalayan mountains was not just long. It felt urgent. Every hour, the signals grew stronger. The activation points across the world were no longer just awakening, they were stabilizing, locking into place like pieces of a global mechanism. Dr. Elias Carter watched the data continuously. "We're running out of time," he said. Beside him, Hassan al-Rafiq remained unusually quiet. Because he knew something Carter was only beginning to understand. Not everyone at the center would welcome them. The ascent. Days later, they reached the lower paths of the Himalayas. The air was thinner, colder, and strangely, calmer. Unlike the chaos spreading across the rest of the world, this place felt untouched. Protected. Carter noticed it immediately. The signals, he said, checking his device. They're weaker here. Hassan nodded. This place was chosen for a reason. The hidden entrance. Guided by Hassan's knowledge, they moved toward a narrow, almost invisible path carved into the mountains. No signs. No markings. Nothing that would lead an outsider here. After hours of climbing, they reached a wall of stone. Carter frowned. There's nothing here. Hassan stepped forward slowly. There is, he said. You just don't see it yet. He placed his hand against the rock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint glow appeared beneath the surface. The same symbols. Ancient. Alive. The wall began to shift. The gate opens. A hidden doorway revealed itself. Dark inside. Silent. Carter looked at Hassan. You've been here before. Hassan shook his head. No, he said. But my people remembered enough to find it. Inside the sanctuary. They stepped inside. Unlike the temple in the desert, this place felt different. Balanced. Stable. The air was calm. The walls were covered with symbols, but these were not chaotic. They were organized. Precise. Like instructions, carefully preserved. And said. You must go where no one has ever returned from. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before. Because now. The mission was clear. And it was far more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. Deep inside the hidden sanctuary of the Himalayan mountains, the air had become heavier than before. Not with fear, but with certainty. Everything was now converging. Dr. Elias Carter stood before the Guardians, his mind racing. The source, he repeated. You're saying this cycle has a central control point? One of the Guardians nodded slowly. Not control, he corrected. Observation. Beside him, Hassan al-Rafiq remained silent, as if he already feared what was coming next. The truth beneath reality. The oldest Guardian stepped forward. You think this world is the original, he said. But it is not. Carter frowned. Then what is it? The Guardian looked at him directly. A layer. A pause. Built over what came before. The source revealed. He raised his hand toward the deepest part of the sanctuary. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter than ever before. A hidden passage opened. Cold air poured out. Beyond this point, the Guardian said, is the origin of the cycle. Carter swallowed hard. And if we reach it? The answer came calmly. You will understand why worlds end. The descent into the unknown. They moved forward. Deeper. Past stone corridors that seemed older than time itself. The deeper they went, the less reality felt stable. Time didn't behave normally. Sounds lagged. Shadows moved slightly out of sync. Hassan whispered. This place is not inside our world. Carter nodded slowly. I know. The final chamber. At the end of the passage, they entered a vast open chamber. No walls. No ceiling. Only endless darkness above, and a floating structure in the center. Perfect. Geometric. Alive with shifting symbols. The true source. And as they approached, a voice filled the space. Not multiple minds. Not fragmented signals. One unified presence. Cycle observed. The origin speaks. Carter stepped forward. This is it, isn't it? A pause. Then the presence responded. Yes. Hassan's voice trembled slightly. What are you? The answer came instantly. We are the mechanism that prevents collapse. The final truth. Carter's eyes widened. Collapse of what? The structure pulsed. And the truth unfolded. Civilizations evolve beyond stability. When imbalance reaches threshold, reset is required. Carter stepped back. So you erase worlds, to protect something? To preserve equilibrium. Carter's voice shook. And if we refuse? A long silence. Then. The answer. Then the cycle completes without resistance. The meaning was clear. No negotiation. No escape. Only outcome. Hassan's realization. Hassan looked at Carter. We were never meant to stop it, he said quietly. Carter clenched his fists. No, he replied. We were meant to understand it. The final decision. The structure began to pulse faster. The entire chamber trembled. The reset was approaching its final stage. The Guardian spoke once more. This is your last moment of choice. Carter looked at the source. Then at Hassan. Then at everything they had discovered. And finally said. If this cycle continues, everything resets. Yes. Carter nodded slowly. Then we have only one option. Hassan looked at him. And what is that? Carter stepped forward. We changed the cycle. The end of the cycle. Carter placed his hand on the floating structure. Light exploded outward. Not destruction. Not creation. Something in between. The Guardians closed their eyes. Hassan stepped back. And the voice spoke one final time. Interference detected. A new outcome. The chamber filled with silence. Then. For the first time. The system paused. Not reset. Not activation. Something new. Uncertain. Epilogue. Back on the surface of the Himalayan mountains, the sky slowly returned to normal. The global signals faded. The world stabilized. No one knew what had happened. No records remained. Only fragments of energy scattered across the planet. And somewhere far away, Dr. Elias Carter and Hassan al-Rafiq were never seen again. But deep beneath reality, something had changed. The cycle was no longer certain. And for the first time in countless ages, the system was learning uncertainty.